Well, good morning. It is good to be here, even in our new normal. I hope you're enjoying your long weekend, although I know that for many of you, the past 2 months has felt like one long weekend. I struggle with the fact that I can't actually see you. I just have to trust that you're there. So one way that we can engage with each other a little bit more than just watching a screen is to use that comment section. If you're watching on Facebook, write comments, say hi to each other, interact with what I'm saying. And you can even use those little emoji buttons at the bottom right of the screen if the story makes you feel angry, happy, or sad, whatever. I encourage you to use those. We are wading deeper into our series called Fearful and Faithful. It's about the life of Moses. He led an epic life filled, however, with very human moments: doubt, emotion, failure. So this morning, as you listen to this story, I want you to engage with it. I encourage you to try to enter into the emotion of what the people in the text are feeling, to try to imagine what it would have been like to be there, to be Moses. As much as these stories tell us about Moses, they also tell us a lot about ourselves. I'll say straight up that there's a certain irony to this moment. When we planned out this sermon series a number of months ago, we thought right around here we'd design a sermon called When Things Don't Go as Planned. And here we are with this sermon, and this sermon is one of those things that's not going as planned. In fact, very little in my life, and especially Allison's life, and I know all of your lives, very little has gone as planned over the past couple months. We could have never foreseen this, not even close. What was it that John Lennon said? Life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans. That seems to be about right, doesn't it? Can I tell you a story? A long, long time ago, it was a simpler time, a different time. I call it January. I had this idea. Call it a resolution. That every day when I come in to my office to do some work, in the middle of the day, I'm going to do some exercise. I'm going to go in the gym, and I'm going to maybe shoot around for a little bit, just to, start a new healthy routine in my life. I know, I'm inspiring. So I think it was the first or maybe even the second time I did it. I brought my basketball shoes in and my shorts, and I took a drink of water. I stretched. I even took a few warm-up shots. And wouldn't you know it, within 5 minutes, I had started a fire. Yes, that's right. My exercising had caused a fire in the gym. This would be the appropriate time to use the fire emoji. I don't know if there is one, but this would be the appropriate time. It's not important how or why a fire got started. Something about dust in the radiator. I couldn't quite explain it to the fire department. The important thing is that I learned a very clear and important lesson that day, and that is that exercising leads to disaster. I'm sure you have learned the same thing at one point or another. There's some joke in here about feeling the burn, but I'm not going to say it. I kid, of course. These kinds of disruptions, small things like this, they happen to us all the time. Often, however, when our life doesn't go as planned, it can be much more serious, much more heavy. All you have to do is listen to the headlines or look at your agenda for the year, and you see that things haven't quite gone as planned. Everything is canceled. I especially feel for summer camps and universities that aren't going to be able to do their normal thing in the fall or in the summer. The unfortunate thing is that when things like this happen in our life, when things don't go as planned, there doesn't really seem to be an obvious lesson that we can learn. I mean, sometimes there doesn't seem to be any lesson at all when things don't go as planned. Today's story is one of those times. Something horrible happens in this story, and we don't know why. We're never told. It's hard to say what we can learn from it. And sometimes finding a lesson isn't really the point. Let's jump in. See, Moses has now left this encounter with God that he had at the burning bush. As Paul told us last week, God called him to return to Egypt to liberate the Hebrew slaves from Pharaoh's oppression. And Moses protested, he bemoaned his inadequacy for the job, but God promised Moses that he would give him everything he needed, including his own very presence. And so now the stage is set. Moses reunites with his brother Aaron. They return to Egypt and they enter Pharaoh's courts. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be there? Not only are they standing before the most powerful person maybe in the world, from a long line of tyrants, but Moses is actually standing in the midst of a palace that he used to call home. You see, Moses grew up here. You can imagine the memories flooding back to his mind. Also the questions. Will this new Pharaoh show kindness to Moses? Will he dismiss him as crazy? Will he throw him and his brother in the dungeon? So here they are. They look up at Pharaoh. Aaron opens his mouth. He takes one step forward, and in a way, they both take 2 steps back. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go. The words ring through the hall and fall flat. The ridiculousness of this request suddenly becomes apparent. Pharaoh doesn't seem to understand. He's never heard of this God, and even if he did, why would he listen to the God of his slaves? Clearly, that God doesn't have enough power to do anything. Pharaoh says to them, perhaps amused, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work." How would Moses feel in this moment? Frustrated, maybe angry, embarrassed. Well, it gets worse. Moses and Aaron are sent out of the court. They return to the Hebrew slaves who look to them for news. What happened? What did Pharaoh say? Are we free? Not exactly. Not even close. Meanwhile, Pharaoh is stewing with anger. How dare Moses make this request? Does he think that his privileged upbringing entitles him to ask such a thing? You don't give slaves the week off. There's only one thing to do, according to him. Word gets out fast that Pharaoh has ordered an increase in the workload for the slaves. No straw will now be provided for the Hebrews when they make their bricks, and yet their production quota will be the same. They have to make the same number of bricks, but now they have to gather straw that used to be provided for them. No straw means that they have to get up even earlier in the morning, maybe even send their children out into the fields to gather straw. They have to wander the land, find dried grass that they can mix into their bricks, but undoubtedly it'll be more difficult. Less straw means weaker bricks, means some bricks might crumble, means they might have to make even more, one failure on top of another. This is a terrible punishment. It becomes clear to everyone that Pharaoh is insane. They are dealing with a formidable enemy. This work is the kind of backbreaking labor that kills an already impoverished people. This is the kind of event that turns a potential hero like Moses into the worst thing that has happened to the Israelites in a generation. The people quickly turn on Moses and they spit this at him: "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." We now turn to Moses alone and in a moment of crisis. If there was a movie, this would be the close-up shot. This may be the lowest moment in his life. Everything he thought he knew is now in question. I want you to listen for the pain in his words. Can you feel it? Can you relate to them? He cries out to God, "Why, Lord, have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." Ouch. The same old fears and insecurities that have haunted Moses his whole life rise to the surface again. He feels like an imposter. He feels like a failure. He feels like a problem. And God's not doing anything about it. Big questions like this can haunt us every time disaster strikes. Why did this happen? Why me? Where's God? Have you ever asked yourselves those questions? Have you ever asked yourself about your worth or your purpose or even your faith in light of a total failure? Our chapter today, Exodus 5, ends here. It doesn't go on. Looking back on this story, I cannot tell why this happened to the Israelites. Doesn't God have some kind of grand rescue plan? Didn't he promise to deliver the people to be with Moses as he led them courageously through to the other side? Of course, you and I know how the story ends, but Moses doesn't. All he feels is the sheer failure of the moment. The shock of his plan backfiring. The guilt of somehow being the cause of so much suffering for his people that he is supposed to be helping. What can we take from a passage like this? I'd say there certainly isn't a clear-cut moral to the story. In fact, all of Exodus is kind of like that. In fact, we can't even say that the Bible is a book of morals or even lessons. Rather, it's a story that calls us into it. But there are a few things that we can at least observe from Moses' response that can teach us what it means to be human and how to move forward in defeat. The first thing, don't hold back. Now, Moses doesn't hold back with his questions. Again, he says, "Why, Lord, have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me?" I find it constantly fascinating that the Bible is so honest about the flaws of its heroes and the honest issues that they bring up about God. This doesn't look good on Moses, and it doesn't look good on God. But it's kind of how real life works, isn't it? And the Bible doesn't hide it. Why should we? And Moses certainly doesn't hold back. He takes what he feels, his raw turmoil, and he brings it before God. It's a paradox almost, telling God about your doubt, but it's where we find real life so often. If you're familiar with the ancient spiritual practice of examine, one of the core features of it is at the end of the day to recall the events of the day, but also your emotions, and then converse with God about them. As one person has told me, emotions tell us where we've really lived. And Moses' questioning of God and of his purpose remind me of that line from the New Testament, I do believe, help my unbelief. So often I find myself caught in the tension of faith and doubt, and I've come to see them less as opposites and more of two sides of the same coin, two dynamics that are always at play and playing off each other in our spiritual experience. It is good to ask these kinds of questions. The Bible forces us to. Our life forces us to. We can easily lose track of the questions about things that matter. Life and death questions about meaning, purpose, and value. As Frederick Buechner says, to lose track of such deep questions as these is to risk losing track of who we really are in our depth and where we are really going. There is perhaps no stronger reason for reading the Bible than that somewhere among all those India paper pages there awaits each man and woman, whoever they are, the one question which, though for years they may have been pretending not to hear it, is the central question of his or her own life. The Bible is full of soul-searching questions, and Buechner says, when you hear the question that is your question, then you have already begun to hear much. Whether you can accept the Bible's answer or not, you have reached the point where at least you can begin to hear it too. We can learn much from Moses' questions, even if we don't come away with an answer. And I will refuse to try to explain away why this terrible thing happens, why God allows it to happen, or what purpose it might play in the grand scheme of things. I think you can only get so far in that direction. But the journey is an important one. So don't hold back. Here's the second thing to observe. See, Moses is called to be a leader and to carry a heavy burden. If he is to do this with integrity and from a place that is true within himself, he has to go through the process that we are all called to go through in one way or another. We have to acknowledge God's mysterious invitation to die to self. It doesn't sound fun. We read in Luke 9 that Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. He also said, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And Paul in Galatians says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. What does this all have to do with Moses? Well, might we say that a part of Moses is dying here? F.B. Meyer, an author, describes the scene like this. The agony of soul through which Moses passed must have been as death to him. He died to his self-esteem, to his castle building, to pride in his miracles, to the enthusiasm of his people, to everything that a popular leader loves. As he lay there on the ground, alone before God, wishing himself back in Midian and thinking himself hardly used, He was falling as a grain of wheat into the ground to die, no longer to abide alone, but to bear much fruit. Can I tell you why this happened to Moses or to the people? No. Can I tell you why something terrible has happened to you? No. But can I tell you that God can bring good and mysterious things out of our pain in a way that somehow leads to life? Yes, I think I can. I'm reminded of the passage that Graham read from James. Consider it pure joy whenever you face trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. I will be the first to acknowledge the mystery of how this all works, and even the deep dissatisfaction inherent in our moments of suffering. But will we lean into this mystery? Or will our hearts harden like Pharaoh's and turn ourselves away? The gospel, the true life found in God and in his kingdom, it's a mystery. Friends, we just finished reading the Sermon on the Mount in the winter. And how does it start? With a mystery of mysteries. This line, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, how does that make any sense? I'll let you ponder that, but I'll tell you that in this moment, Moses is approaching poverty of spirit. And through it all, God is inviting him to something bigger. I'll share a brief story. In my third year of university, my friend and I felt called to do something unusual. We got called to move into a residence that was primarily a residence for first years. And it was very strange for anyone older than a first-year student to move into the residence. We felt called to move into the residence because perhaps there's some way that we could love and serve and be present to these young adults in their first year of university. I had rather grand pictures in my head of what that would look like. But I recall very early on in that year when it looked weird, but my friend and I were walking around in matching Bible camp t-shirts. Wouldn't necessarily recommend that. And I felt fear. I felt rejection when I tried to enter into a crowd of people. And honestly, I think a lot of this rejection was in my head and a little bit imagined, but I felt it all the same. Can I look back on that year and say why God had me move in when I didn't see a lot of fruit come from that experience necessarily? It's a hard question for me to answer. But can I look back on that year and say that I was forced to face my fear and rejection, and that maybe God was doing something in me on that front? I think I can say that. Maybe that was a part of dying to self, even if I didn't see any other fruit. My last observation that I want to make is this, and it's a hard one. Trust in God's redemption for your life. This is something you don't actually read in Exodus 5. But if you keep reading, at the beginning of chapter 6, it starts with God's reassurance to Moses that he will indeed still rescue Israel. His covenant promises still stand, and yes, he will redeem you with an outstretched arm. So, that's coming, but I wonder how long Moses had to wait for this reassurance from God. It may have taken a while. And this promise from God does not contain all the details. Can you relate to this? A feeling of uncertainty, hopelessness, but underneath it all, a promise from God, a promise that hasn't changed, a promise that may not contain all the specific details of your situation, but which envelops it with a sweeping guarantee that God is moving. He is faithful, and he will make all things new in their time. And that does include you and your situation. You are a part of it. Your life, or this part of your life, is just one chapter in a much bigger story. That's not to devalue it. In fact, the opposite. As someone said to me, we have every reason to hope that God will make our experience redemptive. Every reason to trust. And not in a vague way that says, it'll all be worth it, or there's a reason for everything, but a trust in God and his redemptive vision for the universe. Hannah, thank you, Hannah, read Psalm 43 for us today, and in it, the psalmist asks God many questions, just like Moses. He says, "Why have you rejected me? Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by the enemy?" I think Moses could relate. But even while the psalmist feels this way, he completes his psalm by still calling God his stronghold and his Savior. Now explain that to me. Somehow, he's holding on to hope. It's a choice he makes. Hope in God's present character and his future action. It's clearly not a finished journey for the psalmist because he still has to engage in this kind of self-talk. His last questions in the psalm, his last questions are to himself. Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God. In the story of the Exodus, God is interested in more than simply freeing Israel from slavery. He wants to transform them from being a slave people to a people who inhabit and live out the good news of God and his kingdom. This involves countless expressions of trust and surrender. Moses, as their leader, has to go through this journey first if he is going to lead the people out of Egypt. Another story. In 2012, this is actually how I met Allison. We were both part of a group of 6 that did a month-long mission experience in Halifax. I didn't have to travel far, but the climax of this month, it was all working towards us going on a canoe trip with some teenagers from an underprivileged neighborhood. So throughout the month, we were planning this canoe trip. We're knocking on doors, handing out flyers, preparing ourselves for this potential, call it discipleship moment. And I tell you, I was nervous, but I was excited. And the day finally came at the end of the month. And the kids came out of their houses. We pulled up the 2 vans, one of them with canoes in tow, and we were ready to go. We were locked and loaded. We started the car. The car didn't start. We started the other car. It didn't start. Both cars broke down in the moment. Things did not go as planned. There isn't really a redemptive ending to the story. The strange thing is that me alone from our group of 6 got to go out for Chinese food and play laser tag with the kids. Call that redemptive for me, not necessarily for the other people. But why did this happen? I have no obvious answer. God only knows. Perhaps there was some fruit that came of it. Maybe it wasn't supposed to happen. I can't tell you. But this is one of the things in my life that I just have to trust that God had some redemptive plan for it. I acknowledge that many moments in your life are much more serious than this, and many moments in our culture are much heavier and sadder. But what are we called to in a moment like the one that Moses faces? Let me recap. Tell God your doubts and your questions. Acknowledge God's mysterious invitation to die to self. And trust in God's redemption for your life. Lastly, don't give up. Don't give up. It may seem bleak now, but don't give up. You don't know what good things are in front of you. This too shall pass. I'll end with a story that lightens things up a bit. Now, back in December, I shared with you from back in here a story about Allison taking our therapy dog Image into a nursing home and making a real difference in some people's lives. Well, things didn't exactly go as planned. Obviously, we can't go into a nursing home anymore, but she didn't give up. If you want to know part 2 of the story in its fullness, all you have to do, if you want to read about it, open up a community newspaper, which you may have received, to page 2, and you'll see a nice little article. Local therapy dog still changing lives. I'll post a link to this in the comments. But Allison and Image are making the most of a difficult time visiting from the parking lot and calling up to the residents in their windows. And they are still bringing love into the world. Thank you. Thank you for being all with me here this morning. It's been an honor. Let's keep walking this journey together, and right now, join in worship.